Oregonians' awareness of arts and censorship was surely heightened as we followed John Frohnmeyer's tenure as chair of the National Endowments for the Arts and the controversy over NEA funding decisions and reversals. There's lots more to learn about this issue, and we have the ideal source. Marjorie Heins is founder and director of ACLU's Arts Censorship Project in New York and author of Sex, Sin, and Blasphemy, A Guide to America's Censorship Wars. Ms. Heins brings to her work an exemplary academic record and distinguished legal and teaching career. She's a graduate of Cornell University and Harvard University Law School, magna cum laude. She clerked for a justice in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, taught at Tufts University and Boston College of Law, and practiced law specializing in litigation, including civil rights cases. Her list of legal publications is consistent with her academic stripes. Some of her accomplishments attest to her position among her peers, such as serving as editor-in-chief of the Massachusetts Law Review for 3 years. Other community activities reveal the breadth of her commitments, such as serving on the board of directors of the Bowen After School Child Care Center. Please join me in welcoming Marjorie Heins after a cross-continental trip from New York to Portland.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I'm glad to be here. And as I was thinking about coming to Oregon, it seemed to me particularly appropriate now to be ruminating about censorship and the American culture wars as 1993 winds to a close, to be doing it here in Oregon. Not only because we're in the midst of your fabulous annual uncensored celebration and Banned Books Week is coming up, but because Oregon looms large in my mind these days as an almost emblematic battlefront in the censorship wars. The conflicts here, your tradition of liberalism and tolerance, of diversity on the one hand, the notorious Oregon Citizens Alliance with its homophobic Measure 9 on the other, seem to exemplify the culture war, as a lot of pundits have described it, that continues to rage throughout the United States. In the last 2 months alone, for example, we've witnessed a small group of radical right-wingers in Tennessee nearly succeed in purging the local library of all books on sex education, while nearby in a Georgia county, the county commission, responding to criticism of a play by the acclaimed author Terrence McNally that had been staged at the local theater, eliminated all arts funding from its budget and resolved for the future not to fund any activity that, quote, seeks to contravene explicitly homophobic, traditional, family-oriented, quote, community standards. The depth and intensity of the cultural divide in this country, as exemplified by those two incidents and by Measure 9, has produced extremities of censorship that still amaze me. And 3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined that I'd be standing up here talking to you or anybody else about sex, sin, and blasphemy, as I titled my book. I was a lawyer in Massachusetts, working as chief of the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, basically doing civil rights enforcement. I'd been an ACLU attorney at the Massachusetts affiliate for most of the 1980s and worked on a range of civil liberties issues, but censorship of the arts just wasn't really on the horizon as a major problem in those days. But then in about 1989, as I'm sure you remember, I was reading the papers, and I had to scratch my head and wonder, as I'm sure a lot of people did, at the likes of politicians like Senator Al D'Amato from my home state, New York, Jesse Helms, of course, who are having such a field day of self-righteousness, tearing up photos of artworks, if you remember, on the floor of the Senate. D'Amato did that because he thought the work was blasphemous. And in Helms's case, he would tote around his dog-eared portfolio of Robert Mapplethorpe photographs. This is described by John Frohnmeyer in his book, and it was quite dog-eared. daring his colleagues to peek at them, usually asking ladies to leave the room first, peek at these photographs, and then try to vote for funding for that smutty National Endowment for the Arts. I wondered, still scratching my head, at what a pass we had come to as a nation, transfixed by this sort of demagoguery, while actual bread and butter issues were ignored on the congressional floor. And I couldn't help thinking of a former era and of Senator Joe McCarthy brandishing his list of names of communists who had infiltrated the government, one government department or another, so he said, and the media reporting all these antics with due solemnity. I was also observed with puzzlement the ways in which Helms and many of his equally accomplished colleagues, such as the Reverend Donald Wildman, for example, of the American Family Association, who made profitable use of our traditional American prurience and ambivalence about sex to stoke up attention and attract funds. Wildman would photocopy portions of a work that he considered particularly pornographic or blasphemous, then distribute them to his direct mail list, warning recipients that the contents might be shocking and promising to send still more if they would forward a contribution in support of his efforts. The attacks on Mapplethorpe, Serrano, the NEA in general, the criminal prosecution, which you may remember in 1990 of a Cincinnati museum director for exhibiting Mapplethorpe's work, the obscenity trials of rap music groups like Two Live Crew, these were unprecedented events, and they prompted the ACLU to create an Arts Censorship Project. So here I am, 3 years later, with many frequent flyer miles logged and numerous censorship battles under my belt, and the book, as I mentioned, which is really a compendium of what I've learned in the last 2.5 years on the front lines of this struggle. If anything, these last few years have left me even more amazed than before by the excesses of rhetoric, irrationality, and just plain scarifying tactics of censorship that are taking place. Some of them I describe in the book. A reproduction of Goya's masterpiece, for example, the nude Maha, removed from a classroom wall at Penn State University because an instructor claimed that it was sexual harassment. A similar incident at Colgate University last year, where an exhibit of nudes by the acclaimed photographer Lee Friedlander was removed after complaints that they created a, quote, hostile environment. Claims brought in both the US and Canada that the presence of magazines like Playboy and Penthouse in convenience stores constituted discrimination against women. Hostile shopping environment, as one of my ACLU colleagues dubbed it. Demands, successful in Florida, to take the Beatles song, Run for Your Life, off the air because of some of the possibly misogynistic or possibly misunderstood lyrics. Removal of slides of Michelangelo's David and Sistine Chapel frescoes and Botticelli's Birth of Venus from public school art classes. Censorship of school library or textbooks, too numerous to name, from Of Mice and Men to Lysistrata to Red Riding Hood and Snow White to books about witchcraft, sex education, or Halloween, to just about everything written by that stand-up godmother to all struggling adolescents, Judy Blume. And maybe my favorite story, demands successful, that an art law professor, this was in San Francisco at a law school, removed from his office wall a well-known poster, which you may have seen, of a certain former politician, his back to the camera, wearing a trench coat, facing a painting, the trench coat evidently open in the front, and the caption reading, "Expose yourself to art." Believe it or not, this was censored. Some students complained it created a hostile environment and therefore was sexual harassment. These sexual harassment claims are particularly troubling because they trivialize the serious harm of real sexual harassment by cynically conscripting the terminology of discrimination law into an ominous and dangerous crusade to stifle speech. And the problem goes beyond these efforts to suppress sexual imagery or even simple human nudity in art. In many circles now, especially academic circles, it's politically and intellectually fashionable to posit a conflict between free speech and equality. It's a profoundly false conflict, I believe. For women of all races, for ethnic minorities, and for any other groups that have suffered oppression and are underrepresented in the corridors of power, free speech, even or especially when it's radical, provocative, or offensive to the powers that be, is not in conflict with equality. In fact, it's our main source of strength and hope. Now, I'm not a psychologist or an anthropologist, so I can't really even begin to explain, despite the racy title of my book, the reasons for this upsurge in censorship pressures in general over the past half dozen years, not to mention the almost obsessive particular American focus on what that most American of novelists, Theodore Dreiser, once described as neurotic America's official denial of the sex instinct, combined paradoxically with the prurience and sensationalism that drives so much of our mass entertainment. In other countries, they're more sensible about sex, and they censor subversive political ideas instead. Or maybe sex is a political idea too, as more than one pundit has noted. Dreiser thought, and quite correctly, that censorship was about control. Control of anything strange and thus threatening, from foreign agitators to extramarital sexual drives. So, Sex, Sin, and Blasphemy is not a sociological treatise, and neither is it a work of legal scholarship, though it does at least wade into the heady waters of constitutional law on such questions as government funding and the so-called obscenity exception to the First Amendment, which was and still is the primary legal and rhetorical vehicle for censorship crusades. I spend some time in the book exploring the government funding question because of the seductive and very successful rhetoric that has surrounded it. The argument, of course, goes like this. It's not really censorship if the government isn't prohibiting something outright, but only refusing to fund it, right? Wrong. If the reasons for refusing to fund are political and ideological. The danger of allowing such extraneous factors to drive government funding of free expression becomes clearer if we think about the implications of imposing such moral or ideological litmus tests as a condition of government support for universities, libraries, research projects in the sciences or humanities, scholarships, charitable deductions, or the maintenance of such traditional public forums as parks and streets where rallies and demonstrations take place. Ideological strings attached to government support for artistic or intellectual activity is thus one of the most potent and pervasive forms of censorship today. It ranges from quiet rejection of arts grants that funders fear might become controversial, to removal of visual art or dramatic works from public exhibition spaces or venues. Other ways that censorship occurs, which I describe in Sex, Sin, and Blasphemy, include the more obvious ones, the heavy artillery of criminal prosecutions for obscenity, equally unsubtle government-imposed punishments in the form of fines, warnings, threats, or just fulminations by the Federal Communications Commission against TV and radio stations that it deems have crossed its dim and uncertain line between acceptable and so-called indecent broadcasting, the most well-publicized of those FCC ventures into censorship last year, and this year was probably the fines imposed on radio stations that carried Howard Stern. I don't know if you get him up here, but he's very popular wherever he is. But I also talk about many of the less obvious forms of censorship. Threats or not-so-friendly suggestions to retailers by police or local other public officers to stop selling books, videos, or music. Political manipulation of government programs like libraries, school curricula, access to exhibit spaces, and of course the ratings, classifications, and labeling of movies. In the last couple of years, we've now seen that extend to music, lyrics, and most recently television. But if censorship is taking such protean forms in the United States today, what can we say about its common themes and sources? The common thread that runs through this crazy quilt, I think, is the drive to silence and suppress supposedly offensive ideas or images, the impulse to blame art and entertainment, which reflects the world around us, for the cruel and often intractable difficulties of that world. Censorship today seems to be so much about this process of scapegoating speech. If you don't talk about the brutal and obscene aspects of reality, then they're not really there, whether the facts to be suppressed are cruel social conditions or subterranean and not always pleasant aspects of human nature. As that much censored author Oscar Wilde put it, the books that the world calls immoral are the books that show the world its own shame. Of course, for politicians, scapegoating speech or blaming the book serves another very valuable purpose. It's a convenient and often cynical distraction from the fact that they are not doing very much to address the obscene realities that I just mentioned. How much easier it is to rail against depictions of violence on TV than to craft truly effective prevention measures that actually address the social and economic causes of crime, or educational programs in peaceful dispute resolution. How much easier to pass laws and cheaper with appealing titles like Pornography Victims Compensation Act, which was one of last year's that was proposed in Congress, and claim, therefore, that you're promoting the rights of women, than actually to legislate for family leave, daycare, funding for battered women's shelters, and advocacy, comparable pay for comparable worth, or sex discrimination laws that really work. The First Amendment is a sacrosanct American principle, but more honored, I've discovered, in 4th of July speeches than in the observance. So, for example, in my work in the last couple of years, in my traveling around the country, I found that almost nobody in America will admit to advocating censorship. So many articles and speeches begin, "I'm not for censorship, but," that I've created a sort of litany that I sometimes call the "I'm not for censorship, but" blues. And it goes something like this: "I'm not for censorship, but this book is really indecent. I'm not for censorship, but this film really violates community values. I'm not for censorship, but this is about the taxpayers' money. I'm not for censorship, but this particular painting is an abuse of First Amendment rights." Perhaps my favorite example comes from George Bush's letter to your own native son, John Frohnmeyer, concerning controversial NEA grants. This was one of the documents that we discovered in the NEA 4 case, the Karen Finley case, and I was one of the lawyers representing these 4 artists whose grants were denied by John Frohnmeyer under political pressure in 1990. And Bush had written to him, and it took us some time, understandably, to get a hold of this document. "I do not want to see censorship," wrote George, but I don't believe a dime of taxpayers' money should go into art that is clearly and visibly filth." So you get the idea. You can substitute morality, common sense, filth, good taste, right and wrong, disgusting, offensive, respect for religion, protecting women, or simply giving parents information as the justifying and usually circular rationale for suppressing speech while simultaneously claiming you're not for censorship. Let me just offer you a few thoughts about what directions it seems to me the censorship wars are taking now. First, that seductive rhetoric about the taxpayers' money, and it not really being censorship if we're just making rules about what art, literature, or other expression can and can't be funded, has not only not been smothered or defeated by logical or constitutional arguments, including court decisions to the contrary, but instead, this taxpayers' money notion seems to have become so embedded in our national psyche that, as I suggested, was already beginning to happen in a chapter of my book, which I call The Taxpayers' Money. The argument has spread from arts funding to other venues, such as public libraries. And we began to see this last year when pop star Madonna's most recent book, accurately titled Sex, was widely ordered by libraries, despite its trashy interior and made-to-fall-apart binding, simply because many libraries, wanting to serve the interests of their communities, routinely order everything that's on the bestseller list. Sex, of course, provided an easy and convenient target for the "not with my tax money" argument. But the net has been cast much wider. This summer, as I mentioned earlier, there was a very disturbing brouhaha in an East Tennessee town focusing on sex education books for teenagers. The activist who started it all simply took the books out of the library and refused to return them. There were also 1 or 2 that were on witchcraft or something that she claimed was blasphemous. Eventually, the library board supported the librarian's professional selection decisions on these books. And this was in part, I think, the result of a lot of letter writing by people in this rural conservative community who nevertheless recognized the dangers of ideological attacks on the contents of libraries. And the county commission, although it came very close, within one vote of firing some of the library board members to force the book's removal, ultimately bowed out. But it was a very close call. And what made the incident particularly troubling was that the instigator, a leader of the East Tennessee chapter of the Concerned Women for America, had quite lawlessly just refused to return the books. That kind of lawlessness is not quite on the same level as the protesters in one Michigan town last year who made only very thinly veiled threats of physical harm against the librarian who stolidly stood by Madonna's volume of masturbatory enlightenment. But the principle is the same. Lawlessness and vigilantism by some in the service of controlling what their fellow citizens may say, see, or know. And for those of us who are passionate fans of libraries and the role they have traditionally played in providing grazing range for inquiring, often young minds, and often those who can't afford to buy books, the extension of taxpayers' money censorship rhetoric to attacks on libraries is very frightening stuff indeed. The second very noticeable development on the censorship front this year, I think, is the increasing virulence and blatantness of the homophobia that drives so much of the current censorship wars, and in fact has driven them since their inception, really, with the Mapplethorpe controversy in 1989. Phobia is probably not a strong enough word for it. It really seems to me like unalloyed hatred. With Oregon's own Measure 9, a version of which has now been passed, I'm told, in about 8 of your municipalities, and its proclamation that homosexuality is, quote, abnormal, wrong, unnatural, and perverse. I hardly need to tell you about the anti-gay bigotry that seems to drive so many censorship campaigns. Measure 9 would have required, among other results inimical to free expression, the scouring of public library shelves, the sanitation of art exhibits or theatrical productions that received any public support, the censorship of school curricula and activities, all to purge them of any hint of toleration or even acceptance, not to mention advocacy for gays. Everything from Sappho to Caravaggio would be ripe for the censor's axe, and I doubt that Shakespeare, with all the cross-dressing and same-sex flirting that goes on in his plays, would escape either. Explicitly anti-gay censorship of this sort has cropped up elsewhere this year, so you shouldn't feel alone. In Utah, the Board of Education's curriculum guidelines explicitly prohibit, just along the lines of Measure 9, anything that might be construed as advocating even tolerance or understanding of homosexuality. And as I mentioned earlier, in Cobb County, Georgia, relatively fleeting references to homosexuality and AIDS in Terrence McNally's play Lips Together, Teeth Apart led to a county commission resolution pledging not to fund any activity that seeks to contravene existing community standards explicitly defined as pro-family and anti-gay. A proposal to restrict county arts funding in Cobb to works that, quote, advance and support strong community family-oriented standards was abandoned, presumably because the county commissioners realized that such a funding restriction would either be unconstitutional or impossible to implement, or both. So the county commission simply eliminated arts funding. Now, not everybody, I suspect, or even a majority of Cobb County, Georgia, is virulently homophobic or really wants all art, literature, and theater supported even in small part by the county to be vetted for strict adherence to the heartwarming but vague and faintly totalitarian rhetoric of family-oriented standards. But the forces of censorship in Cobb County were well organized, and the county commissioners were either homophobes themselves or susceptible, as most politicians are, to noisy pressure. Whatever the explanation for this disastrous little turn of events, rank hatred and fear of homosexuality drove it. Not very Christian sentiments, one might say. Which leads me to my final thought for the day. It's about the power of names. The religious right or the Christian right, as groups like Concerned Women for America are often described, have a substantial semantic advantage in these censorship wars that are fought so often on the turf of talk shows and other outgrowths of the mass media, of direct mail sloganeering, of emotionally heightened soundbite-sized rhetoric. Religious and Christian are both very favorable things to be called in this society, but who gave right-wing homophobic censorship crusaders a monopoly on the terms? It seems to me that some effort by those opposing censorship to reclaim descriptives like religious and Christian would be appropriate. Tolerance and understanding for people and lifestyles that may be different from one's own may, I dare say, be considered Christian. Similarly, religious freedom within the meaning of our Constitution means respect for the diversity of beliefs about religion in our culture, including everything from agnosticism and atheism to witchcraft and tantric yoga. The same power of names rears its head at the other end of the ideological spectrum in today's very bitter conflict within feminism. Too often it is supposed these days that feminism means censorship, that all or most feminists follow the teachings of law professor Catherine McKinnon and writer Andrea Dworkin, whose claim to fame is their well-publicized but dangerously reductive and profoundly anti-sexual theory that pornography, as they define it, is the prime cause of misogyny, discrimination, and violence against women, and whose model anti-pornography ordinance enacted in Indianapolis was promptly and quite properly struck down by the federal courts in the 1980s on First Amendment grounds. But how misguided and myopic these false feminists are in their drive to stamp out the sexually explicit in art and entertainment. Obscenity prosecutions have always been driven precisely by the very anti-feminist agenda of maintaining and enforcing the good girl, bad girl dichotomy, and thereby depriving women of the information about sexuality and reproduction that we need to make honest, informed, liberated political and personal choices. You'd think the pro-censorship wing of feminism would know something was amiss when their theories and rhetoric have been so quickly and profitably adopted by the radical right. I refuse to say the religious right. Or when, as occurred last fall at the University of Michigan Law School, their student followers removed an art exhibit that the students themselves had commissioned, an exhibit curated by a feminist woman and consisting largely of work by women, some of it sexually explicit, because somebody had complained that one of the videos in the show contained, quote, pornography. That video, incidentally, entitled Portrait of a Sexual Evolutionary, was a funny, ironic, autobiographical film by a former porn actress and self-described sexual adventurer named Veronica Vera. The film contained much valuable information about women in the sex industry and many insights about the evils of censorship and the diverse ways in which women may choose to explore sexuality. It was far from your typical masturbatory porn film, but that didn't matter once the dreaded P word was used to describe it. Because reclaiming the word feminist is so important for those of us who identify with the women's movement and who oppose censorship of sexual expression and imagery on First Amendment as well as women's liberation grounds, a group of women lawyers, scholars, and writers and other professionals coalesced last year to form a new organization, Feminists for Free Expression, explicitly dedicated to the proposition that feminism means neither puritanical rigidity nor humorless ideological conformity to any one narrow description of correct female sexual behavior, expression, or fantasy. FFE's first act was to help defeat the so-called Pornography Victims Compensation Act in the U.S. Congress. That act, by permitting crime victims to sue producers or distributors of sexual imagery on the theory that the book or movie caused the crime, would have injected into American law a principle of liability profoundly antithetical to the free exchange of art, entertainment, information, and ideas. 6 weeks ago, I had the unique privilege of traveling to South Africa for a film festival and conference on censorship. After a wearying 20-hour trip to the other side of the world, followed by a mind-boggling round of panel discussions, late-night movies, and media interviews, I began to understand how vast and universal is the assumption that censorship, i.e. control of what people can say, hear, see, and think, and therefore think, how universal is the assumption that this is the proper and natural way of things, and how unique, therefore, is our American assumption to the contrary. For in debating how much free speech should be enshrined in the new South African Constitution at this conference, I was the only participant who argued against any form of prior review for films, music, and books. And I think it's no coincidence that I was the only American. Everybody just seemed to assume that prior restraint is the natural order of things. Here we assume the opposite, that citizens have a God-given right to say or see what they choose, with the government bearing a heavy burden of justifying any exception to that freedom. This seems to be a uniquely American idea, and I would suggest we try to hold on to it. As the late, great Thurgood Marshall once wrote, the First Amendment serves not only the needs of the polity, but also those of the human spirit. Thank you.
I invite Vivian Solomon, and then Randy Dunn, and then questions from other City Club members.
You've just described a rather chilling picture of censorship in America as the pendulum has swung to the right. I'm wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on what it'll take for the pendulum to swing the other way. As you mentioned, McCarthyism was a similar situation where the pendulum swung far one way, and now with the demise of communism that is gone. I'd like to know your thoughts on how the pendulum might shift in the arts arena.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm certainly not an organizer. So these thoughts are really not based on any professional expertise. But one thing I think the ACLU has begun to understand, we were always the organization that brought the lawsuit after the bad law got passed, or after the damage was done, after the book got removed from the library. And for a long time, we won in the courts. And I think as a combination of two factors, we've begun to realize that First Amendment litigation, the sort of very gratifying process of charging forward, making your arguments, having them resolved in a judicial proceeding, that although very important that we continue to do that, that's not enough. And I think we learned that in two ways. First of all, we've had 12 years of Reagan and Bush, and the federal courts ain't what they used to be. That includes the Supreme Court, and that is not going to change very fast. So we can't count on the courts quite the way we could in the 60s and 70s. And the second is simply that, as I think learned Heins said, we can have, and this is a rough paraphrase, we can have all the guarantees in the Bill of Rights that we want, but the battle for liberty is going to be won and lost in the hearts and minds of the people. And that means education and organizing. And that's something the ACLU has begun to do, and certainly I think is the primary thing that needs to be done, and I think it needs to be done at the grassroots, where the radical right is being very successful. One thing that tends to happen is, I think part of the disadvantage people who are anti-censorship face is that for the radical right, and for those on the left as well who would advocate censorship, they have an all-encompassing worldview which they want to impose on the rest of us. And this is a front-burner item for them. Whereas for most Americans, they may not really agree with that, and they may, at least in the abstract, not be for censorship. But it's hard to get them so roused that this will be a front-burner issue. This will be something they will take time to write a letter, send a fax, make a phone call to their congressman, write a letter to the paper, get out on a picket line, do the kinds of grassroots, very basic American things that have to be done. And I think that kind of local grassroots activism has to take place, both in terms of the national battles, like saving the NEA and saving the NEA for free expression, not having an agency that becomes so compromised that it loses its credibility or its ability to do its job, but also the local battles. And just to go back for a minute to the two incidents, the recent incidents that I mentioned that are sort of in my mind because I spent a fair amount of time in August working with the Tennessee and Georgia ACLU affiliates on those two cases. In Tennessee, the attempt to censor these books was stopped, and it was a very close call, as I mentioned, but certainly the people in Tennessee got help from national organizations, but that would not have made much of a difference if there hadn't been people there in the state, and especially in that local area, who were upset about it and willing to organize and willing to go to those library board meetings and those county commission meetings. And in Cobb County, Georgia, I think that the organizing hadn't quite gotten to the same point. And those county commission meetings were just jammed with people who were very interested in pushing this homophobic agenda. And that could have gone the other way if the organizing had been a little more successful. So I think that's at least part of the answer.
What often seems to be lost in the public debate on this subject is the aspirational quality of the arts. In your view, what place do the functions of art and artistic quality have in this debate?
I think that that's something that constantly needs to be talked about. And when we first saw the attacks on these very provocative images, the Serrano Piss Christ and the Mapplethorpe photographs and many others, there wasn't enough of a principled and forthright defense of the artist's role and the work. A lot of the arts community wanted to shy away from these very shocking, especially in the case of Mapplethorpe, some very shocking images. And I think that was a mistake. Now, not all art sort of defined broadly to include any product of the creative imagination, and a lot of it is not great. We have popular entertainment. The First Amendment protects that too. A lot of it becomes harder to defend as an intellectual matter or as a matter of just educating about what artists do. But I do think we have to confront that issue. We have to talk with people about what the arts and entertainment and culture mean and what their functions are, and continue to educate. And not just, sort of argue the abstract principle of free expression. That's my view, and I have disagreed with other ACLU people on that, in fact.
Leslie Haldula, member. I'm curious about your opinions about television and radio, where it's very limited how many stations we can have, how many radios can be in the airwaves. Is there any role for censorship, as there is today, in those mediums, say, versus books or movies, which are very easily, you can make more books and it's easy to pick and choose?
The original justification for regulation of broadcasting was exactly as you described. The limited ability, the fact that there had to be a traffic cop function by somebody, presumably the government, different frequencies allotted to different speakers, or we'd just have cacophony and nobody would be able to tune into anything. And that argument in turn justified the fairness doctrine, which the ACLU has always supported, although now there is significant debate, because the fairness doctrine, which basically required that radio and TV stations, if they were going to express or provide a forum for an editorial opinion, provide equal time for the opposite opinion. That was the first kind of content-based, substantive regulation of the airwaves. I mean, there's a difference between regulating frequencies and saying how high your antenna has to be, or if you're cable TV, how much you can charge people, and those are all legitimate regulatory functions and don't involve censorship. There's a difference between that and actually controlling the content. And the fairness doctrine was the first control of content and seemed very benign at the time. But in turn, that has been in part the legal basis for justifying the so-called indecency regime. And the Federal Communications Commission, which I mentioned, is the only federal agency that is an official censorship agency. They can punish you. They can ultimately yank your license and visit a lot of other penalties on you if you violate their standard of indecency. And it's completely vague and subjective. And the Supreme Court has said over and over again, indecent speech, whatever it is constitutionally protected. It's not the same as obscenity, which is some other little category we have, equally vague, which is not constitutionally protected. So here you have a federal agency censoring speech over the airwaves that is constitutionally protected speech. And why should that be? And the justifications that have been given in the famous 7 Dirty Words case, the Pacifica Radio case, were really two. One was the old one about how broadcasting is different from the print media because it is a limited spectrum, and therefore the government has more of a role. Well, I'm not sure that really follows. It follows for purposes of allocating the frequencies, but it doesn't necessarily follow for purposes of content restrictions. The other argument that was accepted by the Supreme Court, or a plurality of the Supreme Court in the Pacifica case, was either, depending on how you read it, protecting children or assisting parents in supervising their children. Under the FCC regime, it's not as if indecency is banned, it just has to be channeled to hours when children are not likely to be in the listening audience. Of course, that also means most adults will be asleep as well, which is part of the problem with the safe harbor. And the most recent thing that's happened with indecency is that Congress passed a law in 1992 that attempts for the first time to impose censorship of so-called indecency, not only on broadcast radio and television, but on cable, where they're really the scarcity of the spectrum of the frequencies is not a problem on cable. Cable, as you know, has almost limitless number of channels. So there ought to be room for everything, including indecent speech, if somebody wants to produce it and somebody else wants to hear it. And anybody who's not interested can turn to one of the other 49 channels on cable. So that's basically an outline of the debate that's gone on, and my view of it is that there really is very little, if any, justification for having censorship of radio or TV, that it is a medium of expression just like any other, and in our society right now, perhaps the most powerful and pervasive.
Ginny Cooper, City Club member and director of the Public Library here. Our colleagues just across the river in Washington at Fort Vancouver Library recently won a funding measure, and they won it by a very narrow margin. Very strong forces who opposed their policy, which is the same as ours, which is that children have access to whatever is in the collection. And we urge parents to work with their children to select material that's right for their own child. Came under very heavy attack, and it was very loud noises opposing their funding measure as a result of that. That's not the first library where that's happened, and it won't be the last. Do you have advice for all of us who care about libraries?
I talk in my book about hot-button issues, and one of the hot-button issues is children, and children and sex particularly. And there seems to be this notion that we all are supposed to accept the fact that information about sex is inappropriate for children. And therefore, society has some general interest in protecting children from this. And that, as I mentioned, has been part of the justification for broadcast regulation. And it's not, I guess, a very popular position to take, but I would urge that we need to explore that. We need to question why that is such a universal assumption. And I think that the argument that needs to be made is that, for the most part, parents are the ones who need to decide, who in this culture and in this society and in our democratic political system, parents are the ones, unless shown to be unfit, who are supposed to decide what's appropriate for their kids. Kids vary a lot in age, obviously. A 17-year-old is different from a 5-year-old, and kids also vary a lot in temperament. And some may be scared or threatened by sexual imagery or information. Others may be much more scared and threatened by horror movies, which are not controlled. And one of the bizarre anomalies of censorship in America, as I mentioned, is the focus on sex. And now, of course, there are attempts to bring violence into the censorship scheme as well. But there is so much that might be troubling or threatening or scary to kids that they're exposed to. That has nothing to do with sex. So these are decisions that I think parents have to make based on their values and their knowledge of their kids' age and developmental level. And for the community, the majority in a community, to sort of take over that idiosyncratic and varying and diverse functions that different parents have in terms of bringing up their kids, and try to impose one moral or religious standard it may be very majoritarian and democratic in that sense, but it certainly is contrary to the other theme that we have in our Constitution, which is protection against the tyranny of the majority, for individuals to raise their kids as they see fit. And my own experience with my kids is that up to about age 10, it didn't matter what sexual information you gave them, they weren't really very interested. They would not find that interesting, or they would say, oh, that's gross, I can't believe that, and move on to something that was more interesting to them. But I remember an experience with my son when he was 6 or 7, and I took him to Treasure Island, I think, a movie that's for kids. It was supposed to be for kids, and he was scared out of his wits because it was very scary music and intended to be frightening. So that was sort of a lesson to me.
I'm Joe, an $8 member. You're getting closer and closer to the question I had in mind. So I'm assuming that you feel that parents at least have a right to choose what their children see and read. Now I'd like to ask about the only question remaining. Do you think it is wise on the part of parents to censor and control what their children see or read? Or should it be left entirely to the children because they have a freedom to explore, or do we have a double standard?
Oh, well, that's a little, not only am I not a sociologist or an organizer, I'm certainly not a child psychologist or a family counselor. I thought you were actually going to ask me a question that I frequently get, which is, and I don't mean not to answer this one, I'll try. You know, it's all very well to say parents should be the ones, but how can we control our kids? You know, there's so much out there, from video games to what they see in school and TV, and we can't. We need the help of the government to censor because we can't be the censors. And that's an argument I certainly understand, but I think I just think the alternative is far more dangerous in terms of relegating to the government or to some majority of people what your values that you're going to impart to your kids are. Is it wise? Depends on the age of the kid. I mean, I was one of these, I wouldn't say hippie parents, but I went to college in the 60s, and you know, a lot of us were in rebellion against the conventional standards of the time. And so when I raised my kids, I frankly think in retrospect, I hope my parents are listening here, I did not set enough limits. But you know, then by the time they get to be adolescents, it's out of your hands. The most you can do is you cannot control what information they're getting. The most you can do is try to make sure your input is heard as well.
Kent Snyder, a City Club member. Going back to the area of the radio waves and television, one of the growing areas is the computer information services, the private things like CompuServe and Prodigy, I know, has undertaken this recently, and that they are starting to restrict the exchange of information and electronic mail between the members. I want to know if you could comment on that, and with the idea that some of these services become so large that are they not a quasi-public service that they really should fall under the First Amendment protections and other laws relegating to censorship?
Well, this is very much an open issue, and there's not a lot of law on this, but certainly there are a lot of questions about the liability of big bulletin boards like CompuServe for obscenity, for example. I mean, obscenity, as I mentioned, even though nobody can define it, we all know it when we see it, right? And that can be punished. People can go to jail for disseminating, producing, or even possessing a book or an image, words, pictures that qualify as obscene. And then there is a whole subcategory of laws which are called harmful to minors laws or baby obscenity laws, which basically is the same vague and shifting tripartite standard that defines obscenity, but modified for minors, which of course raises problems in itself because minors, as I mentioned, can be 1 to 17 and a half. But computer networks can carry material that somebody would view as criminally obscene or harmful to minors, and minors may have access to it. So there are a lot of open questions about the liability. Certainly the disseminator of that message presumably would be liable for obscenity, same as a bookseller could be. questions about whether the carrier should be viewed as a common carrier, not liable, or should have some liability for screening all the messages. And there's very little case law on this, and I don't think there's a whole lot in the legislation that covers telecommunications that governs it either. But my view of it is that the bulletin board should be viewed like a common carrier, like a telephone company, like cable used to be viewed, at least for purposes of the public access and what we call the least access part of the cable operation. That they should not be in the business of screening and censoring the information that goes out. They are simply the common carrier, and the actual speaker, producer of the image or the message would be liable just as the same as anybody else would be, whether it's obscenity, whether it's invasion of privacy, libel, slander, criminal solicitation, and so forth. There's a particular problem with the harmful to minors laws, because the notion that you can apply these laws, which criminalize the sale or distribution to minors of material that would be constitutionally protected for adults, the notion that you can apply those laws to something like a computer bulletin board would essentially mean that we would be reducing everybody to what would be fit for children, in the words of an old Supreme Court decision. The same arguments are made with respect to television, that in the interest of protecting children, nothing on television should be harmful to children. And therefore, where does it leave the rest of us with very restricted First Amendment rights? So I think the harmful to minors laws have to be interpreted as only applying. They can't apply to information that's generally out there, whether it's on a billboard or on a computer or on TV. It has to apply only when a retailer actually makes a commercial transaction with a minor and sells them a pornographic magazine or something.
Paul Milius, City Club member. I certainly believe that free speech needs to be absolute, and it should not be restricted in any way. But and your comments have caused me to rethink some reservations, I guess, that were creeping into my own mind about the level of violence on television and the whole notion that in pandering to everybody's vicarious thrill or whatever, the depictions of shotgun slayings, pistol whippings, beatings, all kinds of violence. The recent tragedies in Florida with the tourists generated a whole bunch of film clips about people being indiscriminately shot down in TV sitcoms or situation dramas. Where is there a line that can be drawn, I guess is the question, that says we are, by indiscriminately allowing depictions of violence on television, we've created an atmosphere, especially for people who have grown up with nothing but television as their major media, that it's okay to spray the schoolyard with bullets because nobody really gets hurt and there's never any bloodshed and people don't lie there convulsing as they bleed out their lives. Where is this? Where do we see the social evil of creating this pervading idea that violence is okay and acceptable, and some say that, and some way of limiting that influence on kids who will then go out and shoot their buddies just because it must be okay?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think free speech is an absolute. And as I mentioned at the very end of my talk, what we have that's unique in this country is a presumption in favor of free speech, and it shouldn't certainly be censored in advance. But the government has the burden of justifying an exception. But there are all kinds of exceptions, and although the obscenity one is not one that I think makes any sense, certainly threats, extortion, perjury, libel, and slander are well accepted exceptions. That kinds of speech that can be punished. Your question, I think, is whether there should be an exception, that there is some overwhelming societal justification for censorship of depictions of violence. And the standard that now exists, which I think is the only constitutionally acceptable standard, is basically the incitement standard, a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, where the Supreme Court said it's only when speech rises to the level of actual incitement of imminent harm that it can be punished. And if speech or advocacy is simply in the form of, whether it's abstract advocacy of violence or depiction of violence, that's constitutionally protected. And as far as I'm concerned, nobody has come up with the kind of empirical proof that would link a specific depiction of a violent act to an actual crime that would justify relinquishing the freedom of speech in that area. And it's the kinds of restrictions that we're talking about are going to be very difficult to implement. In a sense, if you're concerned about attitudes toward violence, the kinds of things you mentioned where you see on TV or in the movies people getting sprayed with bullets or lots of fisticuffs and nobody seems to get hurt, the answer would seem to be show what really happens, so that kids understand that this can kill people, this can really hurt. Maybe we need more graphic depictions of violence and less sanitized depictions of violence. It would be of concern to me if news broadcasts were censored, if we weren't able to see the kind of really graphic and grotesque violence created by war, such as the war in Vietnam. That would be a major infringement not only on our First Amendment rights, but on the democratic process, because it was by seeing that repulsive violence in a way the country was able to react. And a lot of people had criticisms, in fact, of the Persian Gulf War because we were prevented from seeing the violence. It was all very sanitized. So it's very dubious, I think.
Perhaps at the risk of censoring the next questioner, we do need to call for time, but I know you want to join us. I think her address has been very provocative and certainly generated many questions and debate. We are adjourned, but would you please join me in thanking our speaker, Marjorie Heins.